Tang Yongjiang was born in China in 1929. In 1937, when he was 8, his hometown came under Japanese attack. His family moved many times for their safety. By the end of the Japanese occupation, they had lost a son and their home.
The Japanese soldier went over, straddled over the Chinese men, violently tore open the man's shirt, bearing his chest and belly. We didn't know what he was trying to do. Then another Japanese soldier with a bayonet came forward and stabbed his belly and his chest. Blood gushed out. It really pains my heart to recall that scene. It really pains me. The man's head drooped. After stabbing a few times, he pulled out the blood bayonet. Then the other Japanese soldiers who was holding the bound hands let go, and the body fell to the ground. We thought it was over. And then 4 Japanese soldiers came up. 2 grabbed the man's legs, and the other 2 grabbed the man's hand. The 4 lifted the body of this dying man, and they lifted up and swung it back and forth, and suddenly they threw it over the railing, and boom, it dropped into the water. Oh, for 60 years, I have not forgotten this terrible scene. I could never forget it as long as I live. I remember one day, my brother, my 4th brother, his name was Tang Yongjiang. He was 3 years older than me. I was 12 and he was around 15 or 16. Usually, we came home for lunch, eat at home. But that day, I cannot remember the exact month. Every one of us came back, except for him. All of us went out to look for him. My uncle, my father, including my grandma. We all went out to look for him, to check whether he has been abducted by the Japanese soldiers. We searched in alley streets, everywhere and all over the places. We searched everywhere, but we failed to find him. And then our neighbors told us that Japanese soldiers had abducted many people from the neighborhood. We kept on searching. We failed to find him. At last, we learned that the Japanese soldiers had abducted these Chinese people and sent them over to northeastern China to serve as forced laborers. We have not heard anything from him since. Japan invaded China. They said they came to China to build a so-called Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. How could you call that co-prosperity? We suffered so much under the Japanese invaders. I recall that, including those in Southeast Asia, as many as 50 million people must have died during the war. How dare they call that co-prosperity?
Tony Cowling was born in Singapore in 1924. He was working for his father on a rubber estate in Malaya when the Japanese invaded. At the age of 17, he joined the RAF in Singapore. He was captured in Java soon after. He ended up spending 3.5 years in numerous slave labor camps in Japanese-occupied Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia.
A fellow Canadian, he had stolen a can of food from the storehouse, and the interpreter, Slime, told us that this is what had happened, and this was the punishment. And blood just laid into this man, first with his fist to knock him over, and then with a bamboo cane that he had, and just beat him to death. Beat him in front of us, the whole camp watching, and this was a lesson: don't steal from the Japanese. We were marched up to a top of a little hill, and facing us was another little hill, and we called these two hills the Camel's Humps. And we were absolutely staggered. There were only 600 men fit to go on this work party, and 300 of us were given little hammers and household chisels. And we sat down on the top of this hill and chipped away. It's a coral hill, so we scraped the scrub grass off the top, chipped away the coral, and then the other 300 men in the party had little wicker baskets. They were just things you could hold like this, maybe 20, 30 pounds. And they put the chippings of the coral into their baskets, walk into the valley, empty their basket, and come back again. And the scheme was to cut the top of 2 hills, fill up the valley, and make an airstrip. 2,000 men. There were so many sick men that they realized, after we'd been doing this for some months, they realized they'd never make an airstrip. We had 300 deaths in the first 3 months. And the sickness was so great that they finally realized they just wouldn't make any headway at all. So the bombs we'd unloaded in Ambon, 50-pound bombs, they brought those in, and we dug slit trenches and buried these bombs, and the Japanese would fuse them, and we'd run like hell into the long grass, and they'd blow up, and then we'd scrape all the scrapings in. And then with the sickness going on in the camp, they realized even this wouldn't work. So they brought in tractors. And one of the tractors they brought in was one of my dad's tractors from Singapore. And eventually they brought in steamrollers, and we built an airstrip. It took 18 months, but we built an airstrip. Do you know, we had to get rid of all our emotions. We just couldn't afford to be emoting about anything. There were just horrendous amount of deaths and beatings going on all the time, that it was just a daily occurrence, and it was part of life. You just had to live with it and not be involved with it. You became like zombies.
Miriam was born in 1940 to a missionary family on a small island off Celebes, now Sulawesi, in Indonesia. In 1942, just before Miriam turned 2, her family was interned in Sumatra by the Japanese. She was 5 when the war ended.
On the left side, there was their office. And when I came there, I sat on the steps, and my mother was already inside. And they were talking at first. And then, you know, I was like a little girl. I was looking at my little dress. And I remember having a dress with little ducks at the bottom, and I thought it was very beautiful. I was very beautiful. You know, in all the misery, I still saw the beauty. Inside, there was a lot of shouting, and there was a whole, a commotion. I cannot tell in words how it sounded, but it sounded awful. When my mother started to scream, then I thought, this is going to be it. So somehow the words from my dad came to me, look after Mama. So I just went inside in my innocence. And I saw them standing in a circle around her. At the top, each held one of the arms. At the bottom, there were two holding her feet. And they were turning her around and around and around. And then one after the other were raping her. But when they saw me, they dropped my mother and looked at me. And they really were caught with their pants down. They pulled up their pants. And at first I didn't know what to do. But then when my mother was lying there and she didn't say anything and she couldn't talk and she looked so horrible, I got her dress and she put her dress on. And the soldiers just looked at us in disbelief. They just didn't know what to do with me, I guess. And my mother had trouble standing. And then I took her hand and said, kom maar mam, ik breng je wel thuis. And that means, come dear mom, I will bring you home. She said, you are never going to talk about this to Papa. He is never allowed to know this. Because of course then the shame as a woman would be on you, in those days. So I took that with me all my life. I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody about this. So I didn't. I had completely forgotten that for 40 years. Until after my father passed away in the 70s. And it was interesting. After he died, I had nightmares about it. And it came back and I remembered.
I know that it's not just China, but other countries that had suffered under the Japanese invasion, such as South Korea, North Korea, and the Philippines. People of these countries are all against the Japanese visiting the Yasukuni Shrine, and they are whitewashing their invasion history. So when I heard that there was going to be a protest march there, I decided to go, despite the fact that I've been suffering from gout. And my legs were in pain. I had trouble walking the stairs. My knees hurt, and I could not walk for long. But I bit my teeth and joined the march. We need to join hands to defend world peace, to ensure that people the world over can live in peace and happiness. We urge Japan to repent its past wrongdoings.
The truth has to be told. I mean, my story is only a small part, and I hope it will be a small part of a larger. And I hope somewhere they listen. the same way they listened to me after they raped my mother and let me go. They looked at me and they listened. They didn't kill me. They didn't kill my mother. And I hope at this time they listen again. If they don't want to listen to adults, listen to the children. There is the beginning. If they want to be honest and truthful to their own children and bring them up in peace and truth and honesty, go to the beginning and say, this is something we did wrong.
I think the Japanese should be teaching their children the truth, teaching the whole population the truth of what happened in Asia. Not, I was talking to a very attractive Japanese girl who bought my book some months ago, and she told me that throughout the whole of her education, she was in her early 20s, she had heard two things, and that was the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the dropping of the bombs, and nothing in between. Absolutely nothing. Here's a girl 21 or 2 years old that knows nothing about the war. And you have to start with the children. If you want to do anything on a long-term basis, you have to start with the truth and with the youth.